when it comes to type 2 diabetes, the last stop for this train is type 2 diabetes. But there's a whole lot of other problems happening along the journey. First of all, how can people know if there's changes with the physiology more early on, early signs? And then let's talk about what's happening under the hood.
Good idea. I think one of the first things to say is that, so I'm working in the British National Health Service with 10-minute appointments and many restrictions upon me. For instance, I can't measure insulin at all under any circumstances. I'm not allowed. So we're working a little bit blind. I dare say in Canada, where you are, you can probably measure insulin, but that would help, wouldn't it? So let's now just get to the model that I use with my patients. A lot of this is thanks to my good friend, Professor Roy Taylor. We've cooperated together over a very successful paper in BMJ Nutrition, so you can read about this, our 2023 paper. So what's going on? Right, so let's begin with the hormone insulin, and this is how I discuss this with patients. If a high blood sugar is damaging, and it is, so we know in fact that if you have a high blood sugar within 6 hours, you've damaged the non-stick lining of your arteries, the glycocalyx. Within 6 hours, a spike of glucose is dangerous. So nature or God or whoever has designed us really well to be protected from spikes of high blood sugar. And that protection is complex, but the most important part of it is insulin. Insulin is brilliant at getting rid of spikes of blood sugar. And then the next question is, oh, that's interesting. So it puts down blood sugar. Where does the sugar go? You know, because questions are more powerful. Asking things is more powerful than telling people things. So where does that sugar go? Well, I think this is Jason Fung. You must know, wonderful, wonderful Jason Fung. I'm sure you do. Well, he's done some lovely work on this and written some very good books. And one of them is the idea. Think of insulin as pushing sugar out of the bloodstream and inside cells where it can do a lot less damage. A bit like a nuclear dump. So the sugar goes in the cell, and what happens to it? Well, a lot of it is turned into fat. And so this relates to all sorts of things, and this can be how you develop a bigger belly, that you start getting a fatter tummy. On top of that, fat is building up inside your liver. And in fact, we know now that 1/3 of everybody in the developed world has got fatty liver. We know that. There's some really good papers on that, 1/3. Then you've got a problem because fatty liver interferes with the good work of insulin, so that insulin doesn't work as well, and you become insulin resistant. It's the first thing. And if we think this through, you still have that imperative to reduce blood sugar, but your insulin isn't working as well. So what does the body have to do? Produce more insulin. And that is hyperinsulinemia. So you then have two problems. One is insulin resistance, and the other is high levels of insulin. And there are some conditions which in part are caused by hyperinsulinemia. And I happen to believe essential hypertension is one of them, where insulin interferes with how you get rid of sodium at the kidneys. I've written a paper on that with Professor Brady, a professor of cardiology at Glasgow University. So you have that. You have insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. For years, probably getting gradually worse. But then there's another unfortunate thing working against you. because fat is building up in the pancreas also, the organ struggling to produce all that insulin. And eventually what you have is a breakdown of homeostasis, where you cannot produce enough insulin to regulate your blood sugar. And at that point, blood sugar starts going up. But actually, probably for 10 years before then, you've had a problem that you didn't know about. Roy Taylor calls it the long, silent scream from the liver, which he's trying to tell clinicians, think about abnormal liver function, think about fatty liver, because it's a call to do something different. So then you come to, well, what might you notice in, which was the other part of your question, what might somebody notice? Well, of course, if your waistline's getting bigger, if your belly's getting bigger, it's quite likely your insulin isn't working as well. Doesn't necessarily, but it's quite likely. And then also, if you're insulin resistant, you have a problem with energy. So you may fail. This is what happened to me for certain, that I lacked energy and drive. I had another problem as well, which was concentrating. I had brain fog. I couldn't think clearly. I didn't realise that until I was sorted out, because then suddenly I thought, I haven't thought as well as this for years. So these are all things that you could notice: tiredness, a big belly, and maybe a brain fog. What your physician might notice is, I'd specifically talk about a raised triglyceride, because the fat that is produced in the liver by all that excess sugar under the influence of insulin is triglyceride. And again, I used to ignore high triglyceride levels because statins don't help them very much, and I didn't really know what it meant. Well, actually, a high triglyceride level arguably is a far more important cause of cardiovascular disease than a raised cholesterol of any type. And so I'm watching people's belly, I'm watching the triglyceride HDL ratio, I'm watching blood pressure. And of course, all of these are part of the metabolic syndrome. And type 2 diabetes is a reasonably late player, and you've got a problem years before then. It's interesting, what we've discovered in our own work is that progressively, the more damaged you are in terms of your metabolism, the harder it is to solve. So if I take, if I take 100 people with pre-diabetes, so these are people who still have quite a lot of control of their blood sugar, but it's beginning to slip. Well, if they go low carb, 93% of them will end up with an absolutely normal blood sugar, 93%, and none of them will develop type 2 diabetes, not one, over a period of years. Okay, if I leave you alone and wait until you've developed type 2 diabetes, and then I try low carb, which is the diet we'll end up talking about, if I try low carb in the first year after diagnosis, 73 out of the 100 will end up getting drug-free remission. If I leave it, or if you leave it for 5 years, I'm getting about 51%. So you see, the longer you leave this, the more metabolically damaged you are, and the harder it is to solve. So really, it makes a lot of sense to swim back upstream. Particularly, I don't know, if you were thinking about your children, I don't know whether you've got any children, but if you had children, and if you loved them, well, wouldn't it make more sense to start a bit earlier rather than waiting as I did? Really? Shouldn't we be thinking about prevention? What about our children? What about what happens to them? Because we know, in my own practice, so as a young man back in 1986, I never, ever So anybody with type 2 diabetes under, let's say, 55, and most of them were over 70. We even had a different name for it in those days. It was called maturity onset diabetes. I never saw it. And now regularly, I've seen people this afternoon in their 20s. That's a new disease. It's very sinister. And think about this also. The damage that diabetes does to your arteries is a function of time. So the younger you are, the greater the potential for harm. So, maybe if somebody's over 80, they could maybe enjoy a bit more carbohydrate and let it drift a bit, possibly. Although I don't even, quite care for people over 80 even. Maybe 90. If you were 90, you could perhaps leave it. But a younger person, I'm trying really hard. Really, really hard. I hope that's answered your question, actually.
That's great. And I think it's important to caveat what you said there about seeing more type 2 diabetes and seeing it younger, because somebody listening may be saying to themselves, okay, you're a diabetes expert. More people are going to come see you. But you run an NHS practice.
Right, yes.
Where
Thank
you're
you.
working with people in your proximity. So it is actually a valid marker of the change.
Oh, yes. So again, let's just explain that. So I'm a National Health Service GP. We are allocated our patients according to where they live. And both I and the patients have no choice in this matter. Only death, only my death or theirs allows us to escape each other. So we've got 10,000 patients in a geographical area. And they're fixed. They're our patients. And again, I happen to know that when I started in my practice, I audited a month after I came into the practice, and there were 56 people with type 2 diabetes. We've now got about 600. So that's a tenfold increase. And that kind of epidemic is actually a pandemic, and it's reflected all over the world. Steadily, there are more people with diabetes, and they are younger. And also they're getting fatter, they're heavier. Many of the young people I deal with, they very often weigh around 120 kilos, something like that. They're very heavy people. So there you go.
One thing I want to highlight that you brought up are these underlying changes that happen before type 2 diabetes. Because if we just say type 2 diabetes, people listening may go, okay, I'm not there right now. I don't have to worry about this. It's not me. But I want to highlight the fact that there's vascular damage, high blood pressure, adipose tissue accumulating, potential connections to cancer, neurodegeneration, mental issues. This could go on and on.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's why this is so important and beyond, to me, this diagnosis of type 2 diabetes.
Great point.
Because the major problems are happening 10, 15 years potentially before that.
Yeah. Are you confident? So it's a bit like death. Let's talk about death for a minute. So really, here we are. We're worrying about heart attacks and strokes, cardiovascular disease. And as you correctly said, insulin resistance is linked to 8 forms of cancer, particularly breast. And we're seeing increases in colorectal cancer because of this. So most people would rather not die, and most people are, would rather avoid cancer, and they'd rather avoid cardiovascular disease and strokes. So really, it's most people, isn't it? Isn't it? A third of deaths are cancer and a third are cardiovascular disease. So it's kind of 2/3 of all the deaths. And what if you could live longer? Or particularly, a moment on cancer. We obsess about improving cancer treatment. But we know that 8 forms of cancer, there's a strong association with cancer and central obesity. Shouldn't we be obsessed equally with prevention of cancer? Because if you had, like me, spent 40 years caring for people, and when you tell them they've got cancer, it's almost like their life is over. They're living from that moment on in fear, real fear, because Well, it may have gone away, but will it come back? What's that pain in my back? Is it a secondary? I'm coughing a bit. What's that? So it's a sentence. It's a cruel sentence. And so really, I'm quite interested in the idea of prevention. And wouldn't that, if we only think about all the money spent on cancer research, which is good. It's good. But have we really had value out of all that research? Which is another point, I think, of Jason Fung's, isn't it? And what if we let's put a lot more energy into thinking about a healthy species-specific diet. So if you had a human being in a zoo and you wanted to look after your pet human being, what would you feed them to keep them maximally well? And isn't that what our children should be having? And isn't it what we should all eat? Because if you keep somebody in a zoo and you give them the wrong diet, well, there are problems, aren't there? And I believe what we're seeing at the moment is a gigantic experiment, a huge experiment with us all in there. And many of us are eating the wrong foods. And I'm seeing the consequences in every clinic I do. And, if you care for people, that's a bit sad, really.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
Do you want pleasure now? Do you want something far better in the future? So if you want pleasure now, eat the trifle, eat the cake. But if you want a better future, well, you've got to work towards that. Let's put a lot more energy into thinking